What up, everybody? Welcome to the Bold Barrio podcast. Yo, we have a very special guest today with us. A friend of mine, a brother, and we have a great conversation just uh, in this episode. And so I'm just excited to dive into this. So let's jump in. I want to introduce to you my good friend, Zach Matchett.
Jeff
Zach.
Bamaka. Oh, sorry. That's what you should have said, not me.
Zach, how you doing, brother?
Good to see you, my friend. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Can you just share a little bit about yourself, and I'll kind of share how we met and whatnot.
Yeah. My name is Zach, married to Lauren. We'll be married 10 years in August.
Nice.
We have four kids. Our oldest, Addie, is 5. We have twins, Luke and Emily, who are 3.5. And we have a new little one.
Yes.
Just arrived last month. Riley Rose was born on March 16th.
Wow, that's awesome.
So she
Congrats.
is, well, by the time we're recording this, she's just a little over a month old. And serve as been in ministry, full-time ministry for right around 15 years, and currently serve at Northview Church in Central Indiana, overseeing the student ministry at our broadcast campus in Carmel, Indiana, and kind of do a player coach role. So I am the 5th and 6th grade pastor, but then I also oversee the student ministry and the student ministry team as a whole, 5th through 12th grade. And love being at Northview. Actually on May 1st, it'll be 8 years. So very thankful for the church and the leadership. And
Absolutely. Love it, man. So for everybody, I met Zach. I had the privilege of working with Zach at Northview I was there for 2.5 years or so. And then I moved back home to LA. But I got to not only be on staff with Zach, but for a few months I was able to be under his direct leadership in a way during the residency program, and got to learn a lot from Zach, and just even just being involved in volunteering in the student ministry, just seeing Zach, seeing you lead, and just seeing that example, and just seeing you serve and pastor with such a passion, was definitely very influential in my life. I'm not gonna lie, I took a lot of what I learned from Zach, from the whole Northview students team, and just applied it where I had the privilege of serving in the student ministry here in LA. And I love, one thing I love about you guys, Zach, is you guys have always, even after I left and moved back to LA, you guys have always been there for me, as far as like whenever I've asked, hey, how do you do this? How do you work through this? Kent, I don't know if you knew this, but Kent actually took some time and met with our student ministry leaders, and just answered a lot of the questions that we had regarding small groups and stuff. So just big shout out to Northview students and just the whole Northview church. I have nothing but love and just a grateful heart towards Northview, man. So thank you guys for sure.
You're very, very kind with your words, but you were also holding down with that spoken word rap you wrote for us for Easter, which came out great.
Hey, thank you,
Larry
man.
Gonzalez made a posthumous appearance,
Yeah.
Post Northview life. No, in all seriousness, Larry, thanks for your encouragement. You're doing great things in California, and I wanted to make time for this because I appreciate all your input and your insight. Yeah,
appreciate it, man. So look, let's just dive into it, man. Today we are having a conversation of just the theology of policing, right? And just what the Bible has to say about it. And and that's the thing. I feel like a lot of people don't know that the Bible has a lot to say about policing and just everything that we're going through, man. Everything that we are dealing with, that we have been dealing with. God has something to say about it, and I think so many times we go through we struggle with these things, and we're gonna struggle with them, but I feel like we lack the understanding of what God has to say about it, and it sometimes causes us to be misguided in our response or lack of response in some of these situations and some of these things. And so we want to kind of dive into that a little bit, especially with everything that has been happening. Just, I mean, the last few years, but it's been very, just in our faces the last year, with Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, you know, all the way to now, the last few weeks with Adam Toledo and Dante Wright, and just seeing the Derek Chauvin trial, and even before the verdict was given last week, just the tragic death of Micaiah Bryant and in another police killing, whether you see it as justified or not, wherever you stand on it, it doesn't take away from the fact that it was tragic, that there are people hurting because of that death. This isn't, and we've been talking about this with Jeff, that we're not here just to talk about these things and criticize and challenge and then leave it at that. We want to find ways to be part of the solution. We want to find ways to provide solutions. And this is why we bring, different guests. And so
I think too, Larry, if I can jump in here.
Yes, please.
I think sometimes what derails this conversation is when we say we want to see changes in policing, or we want to see, I don't think we need to defund the police. I think we just need to develop the police. We need to, and so part of that is what derails the conversation is if you speak about the police as a group, the people who are really ardent defenders of the police force immediately go to a very individualistic way of looking at it. Like by saying you want to change the police, that means you want to change every single police man and police woman on the force. Or if you have something critical to say about the police,
you're talking about everybody.
That's right. And I think that's a very individualistic way to look at things like that. And that's just, frankly, a lot of America, especially in the predominantly white culture, is that we are a very individualistic culture. And so it's hard. We don't really interface well with like more of a collective. We don't necessarily make the distinction. And I often say to people that the system is often worse than the individuals in the system.
Yes.
So
agreed.
So you have, and I think the scripture teaches this a lot. When John in Revelation 3 talks about like the church in Laodicea, in Revelation 2 and 3 talks about all the different churches. He has some pretty pointed words to say about the church in Laodicea. You are lukewarm and all these kinds of things. The you there is a collective. It's a plural you. It's not an individual you.
Yeah.
You all, right. But does that mean that every single person in the Laodicean church was guilty of what was being said about them? It's possible.
Yeah.
I wasn't there.
That's
I didn't see this crazy revelation. But I think what's more likely is that no, but they're being judged and being confronted as a whole. And the Bible doesn't seem to make any distinction between those who are innocent and those who are guilty. Because, and I think here's the reason why. The reason that systems become corrupt is that it has to come with the cooperation of those who are good to allow the ones who are being bad to stop being bad. Ultimately, we can't we can't make anybody do anything. I mean, it's the individual's choice
Yeah.
to make the decisions that they're making.
Right.
But the reality is that someone allowed Derek Chauvin to become the person he's become. And the Bible doesn't seem to make a ton of distinction between the individual action and more of the corporate or collective side of it. Ultimately, we know in Ezekiel, it says that the individual sins are the ultimate responsibility. I mean, so it's not like, guilty by association rules the day, according to the Bible. That's not it at all. But the Bible also doesn't dismiss that either. And so I use that as an example to simply say that the system is often worse than the people.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, you can be, you don't have to be a perpetrator of wrongdoing as a policeman or a policewoman, but you could still be complicit in it because you are part of a police force where these things still happen. You see what I mean? Like there's a difference, but they're still related. And so I think a lot of people immediately want to go to so you're saying that I or our police force or in this particular situation. And the reality is, like, especially with the young lady, Micaiah Bryant, it certainly looks like in that situation that the use of force was justified there, regardless if you feel like it should have been a gun or a taser or whatever. They needed to get rid of that situation immediately because somebody's got a knife and they're charging at somebody. Yeah. And nobody's stopping it. Right. Like, that's not a good situation. That's where we need the police to come in and take care of the situation. Yeah. But just because some people might have been wrong to jump to conclusions on that doesn't immediately mean that the narrative is now not true any longer. You know what I'm saying? Like, so for people that want to say, no, the real problem is that, Adam Toledo or Micaiah Bryant were, why are they out at night? Why do they have a knife? Why do they have a gun? Why are they out? Like, that's kind of their way of saying, like, they're the problem. If they wouldn't have made those decisions, they wouldn't have put themselves. Well, of course, I don't know anybody in the communities that those people represent that would disagree with you. Right. So it seems a little deflective, a little bit. But at the same time, and people, and you said it earlier, Larry, with Albert Tate, hey, listen, we're allowed to, like, have a visceral reaction here. We're grieving or we're upset or we're angry. And there's going to be times, because we're fallen people, that we're not going to get every individual case absolutely right. But I think what happens is that the people who are kind of tend to downplay more of the systemic problems will say, well, see right there, like, they were justified in the force, in their use of force or whatever, and they actually helped the situation. And here you are wanting to fund them, and that it immediately jumps to more talking points without any sort of real meaningful dialogue. But the reality is, like, there is serious discussion in the scripture about institutional and structural sin, and it's not something that's taught well in the church today. Not in the predominantly white church. It's just not. It's not talked about to the point where people even deny it even being in the scripture, or people even denying it being even evident in our country today. There have been many politicians and leaders, and there is even some here just as very, very recently, of multiple ethnicities, not just white folks, saying there's no such thing as systemic racism. And so there's still people out there that or maybe that used to be that way, but it's not now. And but because they're not really thinking about more of the more systemic or structural sin, and they don't really know what the Bible has to say about that, they can immediately jump to a conclusion like that. And I think that's premature. So I just want to throw that in there because I think it's important when we talk about the police. We're not talking about the police as individual policemen, police women. It's more of the collective whole. It's in the same way that a church, if something really bad goes down in a church, you're in student ministry, Larry. If a volunteer wrongs a student and it takes advantage of a student in an exploitative way, it's absolutely terrible. But there had to be a lot of different things for that to take place,
Yeah.
for that to happen. But also, it was that individual's choice. But to some degree, the church bears some complicity.
Yeah. Yep.
And people don't want, a lot of people don't look at that situation and go, shame on him or shame on her for that one particular person doing something really, really bad to that one student. And then
Yeah.
we're just going to move on and not think about the church. People immediately want to go, why didn't the church see this? Why didn't the church have policies? Why didn't they have protocols set up in place? They immediately go to a collective
Yep.
way of looking at it. And they don't make any distinction between, Sister Thelma Lou, who probably didn't know anything that was going on in the first place, and acting like she's just as guilty as everybody else. So we're not always being consistent in the way we apply something like this.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a helpful distinction to at least talk about the individual versus the collective.
No, yes. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is something so key. And I think it's one of the biggest problems. And we've kind of been addressing it without really, I think you just explained it so well, because we addressed this with the Atlanta shootings with Robert Aaron Long, where we talked about that, the fact that, like, I was saying I strongly believe that as the church, we should feel a level of responsibility for that, like, or a level of, like, maybe not responsibility, but it should make us question how we're doing things, because he claims to have done it, in a way to kind of atone for his sins in a way, and also, like, help others that are dealing with the same sin, and I feel like there's something that you were taught in your church, or something went wrong there, and then you add the fact that his parents had kicked him out the night before. At least those are the reports. And why did they kick him out? It was tied to what they were taught in the church, that were saying, yo, he's dealing with sexual sin, sexual immorality, and it's not okay, and you cannot tolerate it. And there's that level of, like, we're not going to tolerate it. So if you're going to keep doing this, you got to go, rather than, hey, we got to bring you in closer, and we're fighting with you. We're going to fight with you. Right. And I think it's that whole thing of being individualistic, that whole thing of, like, yes, your salvation, and now we're tying it into something different, but I feel like it's all connected. We so often, at least in the Hispanic community, I've seen this a lot in that legalistic, environment that I grew up in. It was like, yo, it's your salvation. You got to deal with that. And if you're not, you better handle that, you better take care of that. Where it was like, well, help me deal with this. Help that kid deal with that, rather than, kick them and throw them away. And so I think there's a lot of it in the whole accountability, as well, as far as a collective, as a whole. We should all take responsibility for that, for sure, man. Like, we need to see everybody step up and be able to speak up and say, hey, you know what, this is, and I think that's what we're looking for. It's just, all I want to hear you say is, yo, this one wasn't okay. This one, like, this was not right, and we could have done better here. This could have been handled better. But what you said, it's that whole individualistic thing of, like, yo, I got to defend my mans. I got to defend my cousin. I got to defend my brother who's in the law enforcement, and there you dive into that whole Blue Lives Matter move, of, like, that's going to be our response in this moment.
Right. But that actually is more collective. That's
very true.
That's what I'm saying. We navigate. So, like,
oh my gosh. Yeah.
So we're very individualistic when things go poorly. And we're very collective when things go well. So we love celebrating the success of the force or of our team. Like, if the Rams are winning and we're winning, like, we just share in their success,
Yeah.
Like, we stormed the beach at Normandy. Like, wait, you weren't there. Like, maybe your grandfather, your great grandfather was. Like, we love associating ourselves with more of a collective success.
Yeah.
But the moment that things go poorly,
that's so true.
It's just like, oh, don't look at me. That wasn't me. That was that person over there. Or if somebody's challenged, something somewhat collectively, then you're right. It goes
Yeah.
to the individual. Like, well, you don't know this person.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that what that this cop is like what you're suggesting, or that the whole force is like that? I mean, so we kind of navigate in both things. And again, I want to make a distinction between guilt and complicity.
Yeah.
There is a difference. Like, I I don't think in the case of the Atlanta
Yeah.
situation, I do think there were some people that jumped way too quickly in saying that church is completely and utterly responsible for that young man's
Mm-hmm.
decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of narrative talking points out there about all kinds of things, of saying like, they created him, they allowed him. Okay, well, no, wait a minute. The
Yeah.
Bible tells us that it is the individual's choice, and ultimately that's the way we'll be judged. So, uh, but at the same time, I can also say that they're complicit in some way, because maybe they helped contribute to that, or they didn't
Yeah.
squelch it, or they didn't see it, or. But to me, that's totally different than being
Right.
equally as guilty as the perpetrator. That's my
Yeah.
point. And so, there's examples of scripture, like in Joshua. There's Achan steals the plunder from, after God tells him not to do that, and then when he's caught, he and his entire family are killed. We read that as an American, we go, that's totally unfair. Like, their family wasn't even involved in the actual crime. To some degree, God
Mm.
doesn't make that distinction. So, like, again, we're just kind of operating in trying to find right application for what the Bible teaches. But as it comes to policing, I would just certainly hope that all of our law enforcement officers who are Christians sincerely and deeply think about, how does my Christianity affect my policing?
That's
Like,
good. Yeah.
do I have I even thought about that? Like, other than just being, oh yeah, I love God, or I'm a Christian, and I do these things. Are you allowing your theology to affect your calling and your vocation? And so, how do you bring your Christianity into your policing
Mm.
techniques and protocols and motives and the way you see people? Because one of the challenges, and I think this might be one area of improvement for the police force, is that we have police forces made up of people uh, who are asked to police areas of people that they don't have any proximity to or any relationship with
Yeah.
in their own personal life.
Yeah.
You, we continue to employ men and women from suburban environments to police blue collar areas, or we employ people from blue collar areas to police maybe a demographic ethnically that they don't have any relationship with or proximity to. And so maybe part of the way your faith can affect that is to actually be very, very intentional, if you are policing an area that's very ethnically diverse, is to do everything that you can to try to build bridges and make friendships intentionally with people in those
Yeah.
communities, or collaborate with people who are policemen who are the ethnicity of the community that you're policing, to just ask them questions. And because I think a lack of proximity leads to greater sin and
Mm-hmm.
greater misunderstanding. And so that's just one area where I think our faith can maybe help with this area of policing. And we probably get to a lot more about that later. But that's one area where I would like the church, as you said, every pastor should be pulling their law enforcement people close and saying, hey, I know you have a difficult job here. I mean, Jeff, you do a lot of discipleship. What would it look like for, um, pastors and church leaders to pull together all their law enforcement officers? And I know I'm getting a little ahead here, Larry, but
No, go
hey,
ahead.
we're gonna read chapter 2 of Esau McCauley's book, the theology of policing, and we're gonna get together. We're gonna get together for a couple, 2 or 3 weeks, and let's talk about this. Let's look at Romans 13 and what it says, and just have a candid conversation about that. Like, maybe let's not defund the police, let's disciple the police, especially
Yeah,
for those of us in the church.
yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good perspective. And like, I do want to talk about that and what you're saying, but I know Larry wanted to mention whether it was part of of some of the things, our talking points, whether we have the right to critique the police, right?
Mm.
And I think because if you've been listening to that podcast, we're we're heavy critics, and I think we've kind of explained why, but we've never really concretely told our listeners why it is that we're so why it is we critique certain areas of culture, certain areas of the church, and even ourselves, right? And I think first most what at least what I think in terms of what warrants our critique as Christians of a organization like the police, but not just the police, the state, and whatever organization is that it's something that we see in scripture. For example, you look at the book of Exodus and what God does through Israel to liberate Israel from the grip of Egypt, right? From the grip of Pharaoh. Just God's movement within Exodus is a critique of Pharaoh. It's a critique of the system that was oppressing the Israelites, right? And so that's one. And probably the biggest one are the prophets, the prophets in the Old Testament who are constantly critiquing not the police, right? They're critiquing the priesthood of Israel. They're critiquing the leaders of Israel.
The authority.
The authority, right? That's exactly the authority, the ways that these leaders are leading Israel. And what's fascinating, and what you mentioned, Zach, earlier, is this dynamic between the collective and the individual. Like I'm thinking, for example, about the exile and how the innocent in Israel were affected by the exile, by the sin of the leaders, right? They were affected. It wasn't just the elite of Israel that were taken to Babylon, right? The poor, the widow, the orphan, they were also affected by it.
Yeah.
And so where the leaders go, so do their followers, right? And I think it's some way, somehow, and this is something Macaulay talks about, it's the same with the state and the police. What the state allows is going to be seen directly in how the polices, right? And so there's a connection. You're always going to have those who go into the police force and say things like, I'm going to change it, I'm going to be different, I'm going to let my faith inform how I police, and that's amazing. But when you're in an environment where you're in an environment that violence is just the norm, whatever that looks like, right? It could be violence in order to prevent violence. It can be violence because you've become a violent person. That kind of environment forms you. That kind of environment forms your instinct, whether you admit it or not. Like, and that doesn't just apply to the police. It applies to everyone. Where you are, your context, your environment, because we're interconnected, because we're collective people, we're not just individuals, our environments are going to form us. And I'm thinking about, for example, the soldier who wakes up in the middle of the night because they suffer from PTSD, thinking that somebody's there to hurt them, right? They were formed by their environment. And if your environment is constantly bombarded and it's just filled with violence, then that's what's going to form you. And so then, again, this is stuff that we don't know if it's going to work, because this is stuff that I feel like it's cutting edge. There's not a lot of people talking about it. You look for resources on this in terms of combining solutions to policing and the scriptural perspective, and you're not going to find many. One of the only ones you're going to find is Macaulay's. But I feel like if the environment in which some of these officers, not all of them, but most of them, is the environment in which they're coming up is a violent one, and then it's forming their instincts and it's forming their way of being and the way they police, then, like you said, Zach, we need to provide a context in which the way they're being formed is in a way anti-violent, right? That their instincts don't automatically resort to violence, that their instincts don't automatically result to reaching for the gun, right? and it's easier said than done, because again, we got to remember, these are human beings.
Yeah.
These are human beings
Right.
who are in situations that human beings should not be in. Like we just shouldn't be in. Like human beings were not created for violence. God didn't form human beings for violence, right? We look at the creation account and the relation between Adam and Eve and the interconnectedness in creation and the human beings. It's actually violence that kind of breaks, that distorts the image of God in them. It's violence that breaks the relationship between Abel and Cain, right? It's violence, and so I admit it's easier said than done. But if we can provide an environment in which violent tendencies and violent instincts are in a way counteracted, that might result in something, you know?
Yeah. I think about situations too where we want to bring reform and to the policing, let's say, and immediately people's mind go to these scenarios where a weapon is drawn and it's like combat, or where I'm shooting to kill, or I'm apprehending a criminal. And I think if you think policing more holistically, there's a lot that can be done before and after that moment that can maybe either mitigate that moment, or at the very least could maybe make those far and few between. Because inevitably you're going to have those. I mean, at the end of the day, the police are there to protect, and serve the community. And maybe that's part of the problem. I heard Brian Stevenson, leader of the Equal Justice Initiative, say, the police there's some police forces that see themselves more like soldiers than protectors,
Wow.
And so,
wow.
And I think he's got a unique perspective on that because he works a lot with justice initiatives and, works with school systems and, a lot of the school systems in inner cities, you go in, it's like these security officers are more like wardens, they're more like, hardcore things, and some people think, well, that's what they need, I think there's something different.
Yeah, would you there make then the differentiation between, because you said that their role is to protect the community, it's to serve, is to see people, right, as created in God's image, right? They're caretakers. They should be caretakers, not babysitters, right? That's
right.
No, but caretakers, like when they're holding people in custody, they're not just holding them on, like it's more than just putting handcuffs on them and you're under arrest. They're under your care. You're their caretaker. You, like, right, when God asks Cain, where's your brother? Cain's response is, I'm not my brother's keeper. Well, no, yeah, you are. You are a protector. You are your brother's keeper. You are your sister's keeper. And so then there's that aspect, and then there's the law enforcement aspect, right? We're the law enforcement. So there seems to be, like, I love what you said, because then what if we shift from seeing ourselves as just mere enforcers of the law, and actually our job is to care for people. Our job is to care for our communities. Our job is to be present for people. Like, I'm thinking, like, I saw this video of this police officer who ended up playing basketball with this kid randomly in the park, and they were just playing basketball. And then he comes back a week later and gives him some Steph Curry shoes. And I mean, you don't have to give away shoes, right? Shoes are expensive, but what if we
there was a relationship built in that moment?
Sure. Exactly. And now, what would you say to somebody who has an abolitionist perspective? And what would you say to somebody who's like, you know what, like, the system, there's just too many bad apples. There's just too many bad apples, and that means that the orchard is completely bad. Like, we just need to get rid of the orchard. Like, we need something new. what would you say to a person like that? Which I know it's a hard question.
Yeah, I can empathize with it, particularly people whose history, not just family with interactions with the police that have been negative, maybe, but just more historically. I think particularly for the African American community, I could certainly empathize with this needs to be a complete overhaul.
Yeah.
I can empathize with that. I do think that's probably. I think there's a way to bring reform without destroying the institution. And maybe I'm being pie in the sky about that. That's why I said I think there's a way to bring reform to the police force that doesn't eliminate someone coming to when you call for help.
Yeah. Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
I think that what ends up happening is and this, again, we kind of caricature the other side so easily. We need to stop doing that. But I think people may even be listening and what we just described, Jeff, and I think you did a great job of talking about serving and building relationships, those kinds of things. Some people might be like, you guys are romanticizing the heck out of this. Like, this is not even remotely realistic. And listen, I think you can do all those things and not be soft. I think you can do all those things and be completely like not naive and aware of the situation. And the fact of the matter is there's like, what does Alfred say to Batman about the Joker? Like, some men just want to watch the world burn. Like, there's going to be people out there that are just going to go out and just and be criminals and cause a ruckus and do terrible things. And we need people out there to help police our community. So I don't want to go all the way to the utopia, but let's just, let's, you didn't say this, but like, let's get rid of the weapons and like, let's just go up and shake their hand and try to de-escalate the situation. The reality is that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, I think there are dozens and dozens and dozens of situations, what you just described with the young guy, shooting hoops with them. I think there are a lot of people in police forces that do have that type of reputation in the community. And but I go back to what I said earlier. I think if I was advising a Christian police officer, I would say, really do your very best to get to know the people in the community that you serve. And if you notice that there are disparities of, more people being incarcerated from a particular ethnic group, or, there's more crime in this particular area, then look beyond just the actual crimes themselves and like what contributed to that. What kind of things are at play? Like, is there anything that a police force can do to like basically get involved in community efforts to try to bring change and relationships and those kinds of things? Like, are there ways to do that, or partner with a nonprofit in the area, or partner with a church in the area? Yeah, I think those are so many ways to bring reform rather than just what we think in our mind of like a duel. A crime is being committed and the police are called. And, it's the Micaiah Bryant situation. You have a split second to decide. Of course, those things happen all the time, but I don't want to make it sound like that's the only place where change can happen is in those situations. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But I think there's a lot of periphery things that can be changed that can really affect a lot of that stuff. And I empathize with people who are like, we gotta get a complete overhaul. And I sympathize with that. I don't know if I'm all the way there of getting rid of it or defunding. I know defunding is not getting rid of it. Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. And sorry, Larry.
Go ahead.
Like I don't know if you want to turn the combo, but you mentioned some really key things that stood out to me because, for example, you that quote from Batman, right, and the Joker, and even if you look at the latest joke, like you watch the latest Joker movie and all these themes are in that movie as well. And I feel like in that movie, what you see is the rise of a villain and how this villain is formed. Right. And like you mentioned, like people still want to be able to call the police in case something happens, right? But I think, what if we take it a step further? And I know, like, again, I know you mentioned it and people might be like, wait, you're being too too naive, you're being too, and I think it doesn't hurt to imagine. I think that's part of the problem, that we need to be able to imagine a new reality, because if we don't, then that's when things aren't going to change. But like, okay, there are people who are just going to want to see the world burn. And you are going to have your villains, you are going to have your criminals, but just like we want to reform the police, and I think this is where the cry for defunding comes out. Part of it, not all, because part of it is we just want to completely abolish the police. But I think another part, which is the part that I've experienced, is what are we doing to help those villains, right? What are we doing so that these villains, however it is that they're formed and they're created, because they're formed and created. People aren't just born evil, right? I mean, there you can get into your theology of human deprivation and all that stuff, right? But and I believe in human deprivation, but I don't think people are born evil. You know, I don't think that people just become evil for no reason. Like, I don't think villains just appear out of nowhere. Right? There's a lot of factors to it. There's a lot of moving pieces to it. And so just like we want to come up with ways in which we're able to provide solutions for the police to be better, I think as a community, as cities, as towns, we need to come up with ways and imagine new ways of helping people who are criminals, who are seen as villains, and begin to ask these questions. Why are they being formed? Why are they being created? Where are they coming from? What social factors are coming into play that are creating those kind of people? And it's so easy to say it's the parents' fault. It's so easy to say it's because they don't have a dad. Okay, fine. And that's fine. And you still have to ask the question, well, why don't they have a dad? Why is the dad the way the way the dad is? Why is the mom the way the mom is? And what can we do to help those families? Like, for example, right-wing Christians, they're so obsessed with the nuclear family. They're so obsessed with the nuclear family. And what I mean by that is, for them, that's the core of a good society, right? It's the nuclear family. Everything happens in the nuclear family. Okay. But you also got to think about the factors that affect broken nuclear families that are broken, right? Because we don't all share the same reality. And so what I'm trying to say is we also need to think about the villain, per se, the criminal, the bad person here, the one who does drugs. What can we do to help them? And actually be intentional about coming up with solutions to help them. Because if we can find ways in which we can prevent from these kind of people to become these kind of people, then crime is going to go down. You get me? It might never be at 0%, but I'm positive that if we are being intentional about forming and reforming and providing resources for people that are growing up in broken families and broken environments, and being intentional about it and not just declaring a war on them, right? I think change will happen from that side, and it'll just make the police officer's job easier, right? Less crime. And then where the money would come from, that's a whole nother conversation, right? And then that's where the defunding thing comes in. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this too, but I just, on the news, I heard this report that a sergeant was killed. I think it was in Houston. And one of the officers that worked with the sergeant was talking about a reform in terms of guns, and how there are too many people in that area who just have access to guns, and that this access has resulted in now the killing of a sergeant. And so I just find it interesting. And by no means am I celebrating. By no means do I find it interesting in a way of gaining pleasure from it. I just find it interesting that it's just not affecting one side. It's affecting all of us. It's affecting, we're now all just killing each other, right? And it's not just the police killing people. Now the police are killing, now the people are killing police. And it's just it's a scary spiral, it's a scary cycle. And it's just to say that it affects all of us. It doesn't just affect a certain community, it affects all of us.
Yep.
So I don't know if you got anything to say, Larry.
Yeah,
you want to transition?
No, yeah, I think there's so much there. And it just reminds me of the complexities like that there isn't in all of this. Like it's complex. I was looking into this I don't know if you guys have heard of this, the eight can't wait. It's like this thing, the hashtag 8 can't wait, and there's this organization doing this where it's like these 8, I think it's these 8 things that need to be changed, like the whole banning chokeholds, and just all these other things, the other police officers,
what is it called again?
Number 8 can't wait. And you can see, and there's a lot of good stuff there. Like I was looking into it, and it looked like, these are things that should be looked into, that every agency should have. Let me show you real quick. Let me just mention this real quick.
Yeah, I have them right here. The first one is, so 8 Can't Wait is a campaign to bring immediate change to police departments. The first one is requires de-escalation, use of force continuum, bans chokeholds and strangleholds, require warning before shooting, ban shooting at moving vehicles, exhaust all alternatives, duty to intervene, and comprehensive reporting.
Right. Yeah. So these are 8 use of force changes that people are pushing, and there's agencies that have already done this. There's some agencies that only have done some. But here's where I was going with this, with the whole complex, like just how complicated this is. Even these things, like I look at the whole ban, the banning the shooting at moving vehicles. Well, what if the person shooting at what if the person in that vehicle is shooting at you while that vehicle's moving? You're not gonna shoot at that vehicle, like, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like that's just one example of how complex I feel this is, because like here's the reality. The reality is that maybe I'm gonna use this example. This isn't like factual, right? I don't like, but let's say Zach, where Zach lives, right? Zach lives in Hamilton County, right? I believe you live in Hamilton County. Yeah, so Zach lives in Hamilton County, Indiana, right? He's probably, his police agency probably doesn't have to make the changes or the adjustments that we have to make here in LA. You know what I'm saying? Like,
or in Minnesota,
right?
Minneapolis, yeah.
And even that, even saying that is complex, because what if they don't have to make, let's just say, right? Hamilton County has Latinos there. I've seen Latinos there, but let's say they didn't, right? And I move into Hamilton County. Well, there's that, like, is that police agency there still, like, are they set up to also protect and serve me? You know what I'm saying? Like, and maybe they are, you know what I mean? But I feel like it's so complex. Like, it's so complex because it goes back to the whole thing of, like, because because I'm with Zach. I'm not all there with the whole abolishing police, but I definitely understand the sentiment. You know, the reasoning behind it. You know, because you're talking about the people that their generations before. You know, speaking on African Americans, police has never been there to protect and serve you, like for till recently, you started seeing improvement, but you're talking about police brutality and excessive use of force, towards minorities, towards black people. Before that, you had the segregation, right? Police enforcing segregation. That's not protecting and serving and caring for the African American or any minorities. And then before that, you had, you're protecting and serving the wealthy in the North, right? And then in the South, they were slave patrols, So police hasn't been there, to protect and serve you until now, maybe, with still the whole excessive force and the police brutality that, that minorities still experience, specifically more so African Americans. So them feeling like, yo, we got to get rid of police and start something new and start something fresh, I can understand based on that. You know what I'm saying? But at the same time, I find that to be, I find it hard to see that happening. And then, so it's so complex, man. It's so complex because even defunding the police, well, what does that mean exactly? Because that defunding the police, well, who has control of how that money works, right? Because if you take money out, let's say that police agency, says, well, you're defunding us, so we're gonna get rid of cops, right? Or you're defunding us, so we're gonna get rid of some of the trainings because we can't afford to get rid of these weapons, right? Or how are we using that money? You know what I'm saying? So they're like how it's so complex is what I'm saying, right? And so I feel, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, and this is why we're having this conversation, because to be straight up, as somebody who is not in law enforcement, I've done some level of research and I've done some, studying on some of these things, but I still I'm not at the level of, like, to say, yo, these are your solutions, make this happen. I can't speak on that. Maybe there's other people that could speak on that, but I pray and hope, and maybe there already is people within the law enforcement, police officers, that are stepping up and saying, yo, this has to change. We got to hold each other accountable. Let's make these things happen. And I did hear that I believe in Maryland, I think the whole state has like implemented, like, every single police department in Maryland. And I may be wrong on the state, but I'm pretty sure it's Maryland. They have a community board that is there to hold accountable, like, police officers. They're able to investigate and say, hey, this right here was not okay. We need to take care of this. Where not a lot of, like, this is the only state that has that enforces that has said every police department in Maryland, it has to do this. So I think there's a lot of these changes that need to happen, but I believe that as the church, as the church community, as the church body, we do have to talk about these things. We do have to be involved in these conversations. And I feel like the best way, and I'm speaking for myself, and that's the next question that I want to ask you guys, is how should the church be involved in in these conversations? I feel like, because all three of us are here having this conversation, I feel like we can agree that as the church, we have to be involved in these conversations. The question is how, and I feel like for me is, I feel like I have to remind us of the value of the human life. Because we've seen this, and we've talked about this with Jeff, like these people, the Dante Wrights, the George Floyds, the the Michael Browns, the Trayvon Martins, they are sometimes like criminalized to the point where they're like dehumanized, right? Where their lives don't even, like, in order to justify what the cop did, you dehumanize that life. And we saw that with George Floyd, where you start, you're constantly pointing to, he was on drugs, he used drugs, he did this, he did that, he did all these things, right? But, and I feel like we saw this with the witnesses that came, that spoke in this trial, where a lot of it brought the intention of the fact that, this was a human life that was ended, and it shouldn't have been, like, and that's where we talk about, I don't know if it was you, Jeff, or Zach, who mentioned this, like all these factors that play into part, and it goes back to the whole individualistic and the whole thing, the collective, the all of us have a part, to see in this, because that could have went a different way had one of his police officer buddies, would have said, "Hey, that's enough, man. Get up." Get up.
Yeah.
And so I think as a church, that's one of the biggest things that I see. I feel like we need to listen with empathy, man. Listen to each other with empathy. I had a conversation, and I'm saying in all sides, and some of us can some of us are just exhausted, man. Like I understand some of my African American brothers and sisters who say, "No, I'm not trying to have a conversation. I've had enough of that," right? And I could totally understand that, right? But the rest of us that can, we should be having these conversations, and we should be listening with empathy, man. We should be listening with empathy, and we should speak up with compassion towards others, man. Like, when we speak up, when we voice our opinions, which I think we should, I feel like silence, Dr. King mentioned this, silence is not the way, man. Silence does not equal peace, right? We've heard that too. Silence does not equal peace, right? So we do need to speak when I feel like the Christian community should be the loudest voice when it comes to these things. But I think it has to be, we have to speak up for the people. Don't speak up for your political, your political alliance, right? And I feel like I've seen that a lot with the Christian community in the last few years is whenever we respond to certain events and certain things and certain situations that are happening in our country, we immediately respond to it with a political filter on, right? With a political lens on. But I feel the Christian community, we need to take that lens off. We need to say, I need to put these political ideals, these political biases aside, and come to it with a biblical perspective.
Yeah.
And then to tie it, to give it to Zach, I think that's why that's why we brought this up, where we can't speak on these things with a biblical perspective if we don't understand what the Bible says about these things, and what the Bible tells us about the policing, what the Bible tells us about authority, Zach.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the reality is, in our culture today, if you're spending 20 to 25 hours a week listening to cable news or reading social media or following your favorite, politically partisan pundit on what they have to say about these issues, and you're spending, you read the verse of the day on YouVersion, that was your,
man.
I mean, come on, like this is an indictment on the church. The church needs to be a part of the solution, but part of the solution is owning up to the part that they played in not pushing people to really think about how does my faith invade my everyday. Robert Banks wrote a book called Redeeming the Routines, and he said the hardest theology is the theology of the everyday, which is just boots on the ground. Like, how does this make sense for me? And so a couple things. One is, yes, I am 100% in agreement, Larry, to say, how do we think biblically about these issues? You know, like in Isaiah chapter 5, and Jeff was talking about the prophets earlier, and it made me think about how the prophets just, they told the truth no matter the cost, you know. And in Isaiah chapter 5, it really outlines 3 different types of sins. It talks about, you know, personal morality. There's sections where, you know, talking about getting drunk and going out carousing, you know, around the town and just, you know, just causing a ruckus, womanizing, those kinds of things. It talks about the idea of structural sin or institutional sin, things that the average American Christian kind of look side-eyed at, like, oh, come on, like, that's not even a real thing, you know. I just talked about it earlier. Is there anything such as systemic sin or systemic racism or whatever the case may be? But it talks about how, you know, it says, there's a verse that says you go from house to house and field to field and you buy it all up, and now there's no more room for the poor to live. So something that was actually legal is actually resulting in something unjust.
Wow.
And then it talks about
that's good.
And then it talks about how, you know, you acquit the guilty for a bribe, and then you deny justice to the innocent. You know, then it talks about sin being injustice. So in one chapter of the Bible, it actually attacks sin, and I guess to some degree idolatry, in 3 different aspects: at the individual, more personal morality level, at the structural level, and then something that is just injustice that affects everybody. And frankly, I don't think a lot of people know that, because they're not engaging with the text regularly. And again, from my context, and I always hesitate to share this because I don't want it to be like a slam dunk or to be seen as condescending to people. But, you know, they've done a lot of research. Pew Research Forum and Lifeway and some others have done statistics on this, but the least biblically literate people in the culture today are white evangelicals that read their Bible the least and know their Bible the least. The group that knows their Bible the best and engages with it the most are Black Protestants. The irony, of course, is that when African American church leaders and I'll say more broadly non-white church leaders, because I want to include the Latino community and Asian American community and others that speak out on issues, whether it be policing or anything that's more the church attacking particular issues or institutions that need reform, it's usually met with this like, oh, you're race baiting, or you just need to stick to the Bible. And one of these days, I just want one of those church leaders to go. I want one of those church leaders to one day just go, well, how would you know? Because they're not reading, you know, according to statistics, you know.
Man.
But in all seriousness, though, I think about that, like, how can the church step up and provide and really attacking some of those issues? Because it leads to my second point. The more biblically sound we are, we will recognize that it's not just going to be personal conversion that does it. Yes, good. I want people to come to Christ. And there are a lot of people that were won to Christ in churches that promoted slavery. I mean, George Whitefield famously held these revivals and was very concerned about saving the souls of people, but not so concerned about saving their body.
Yeah.
You know, and even here in the country, and I don't want to, come and just bash on all these people, but the reality is, like, this is why it's not just a personal conversion thing, because Christians are still fallen people, even when we accept a salvation that was not earned on our behalf anyway. It was earned by Jesus, you know? So there's certainly room for us to be continuing in sin or doing things that are wrong without the work of the Spirit in our life. So I'm certainly, but what intends to happen is that from the predominantly white culture is that it's what's really going to turn the tide is we need Jesus to come and really affect people in their lives. Well, yes, of course. And my favorite, one kind of surface level example and one very, very profound example. The surface level example is, a lot of times it's like, well, if nobody's doing this on purpose, so let's take policing. If nobody is purposefully pulling over people who are black. It's not like we're seeking them out. You know, I hear this a lot. Like, Zach, do you really think policemen are out there just hunting for black people? No, I don't. But if the statistics bear out that there seems to be an inordinate amount, they're 10% of it's like 10% of this people group use drugs. 9%. I don't know the exact statistics, but yet, like, African Americans are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated for those crimes, even though the use of drugs is almost the exact same as other ethnic groups. Like, if that's the data and it's bore out like that, but you go, well, nobody's doing that on purpose. And my service level example of this is there was a guy that owned a car dealership in the South, and he found out that, like, there was like this negotiating. Basically, you come in with the price and you could barter and kind of go back and forth. And like that was kind of the name of the game, to negotiate the price of the car. They started running the numbers and they realized that white men were getting the lowest prices on their cars. Then it went black men, then white women, and then black women were routinely overpaying for their cars to the point where they were almost subsidizing the cost of the cars. And so they were like checking the numbers at the end. And this car dealership owner was a Christian, and he had a decision to make because he basically has 2 options at this point. He can decide, okay, look, I know that nobody that works this car dealership is a racist. I just know for a fact they're good men, they're good women that work there. And because I know that they are not intentionally doing this, I'm not going to do anything. And our profits will stay where they need to be at. Or option B is we're going to figure we can't have this happen. There's going to have to be some change, and we're going to lose money.
Yeah.
But he decided to go with option B because justice always comes at a cost. The only way for people to come up is if we come down. And that is completely centered, guys. That is completely centered on the gospel message.
So
Jesus
good.
climbed down. Jesus climbed down so we could climb up. So the extension of that injustice ought to be at least something like that. And then the profound example really quickly is Robert Linthicum, who worked for InterVarsity ministry and actually did a lot of church planting in urban areas, had a very profound experience as a young man where God really called him to urban ministry. He met a young gal named Eva, who I think at the time was like a teenager, 14, 15 years old, an African-American girl. Heard her story, came from a very broken family, grew up in the inner city, and he began to have conversations with her about Christ and sharing the gospel. And she ended up coming to faith, got involved in a Bible study, really started to turn things, in a good way. And but she told Robert, I'm being pushed and I'm being encouraged and wooed back to being a prostitute. There's a lot of pressure around her to get into that. And he said, well, look, the Bible says we need to resist the devil and he will flee. And he gave all the Bible answers, right? Like, don't allow evil to have a foothold in your life and all these kinds of things. And he left. He was there for a summer, and he came back a few months later. And when he come to find out that Eva had in fact gotten into prostitution, and he was so disappointed because he thought, man, we're making a difference in the community and we're getting people out of this, really tough part of town and those kinds of things. And he got a chance to reconnect with her. And he said, Eva, why did you quit your Bible study? Why did you get into prostitution? And she was like, I try to tell you that there's all this pressure. And like, and he's like, yeah, but why? And she goes, well, because these men came to me and they said that if I didn't join this prostitution ring, that they were going to beat up my dad. And they did. They actually come and they beat him to a pulp. And then they did the same thing with my brother. They broke both of his legs. And I just thought to myself, I don't want to see my family get hurt. So I finally said yes. And he goes, he's like, I'm so sorry that happened. But why didn't you report this to the authorities? Why didn't you go to the police and tell them that these things were happening? And she kind of shook her head like, you don't get it, do you? It was the police who came and told me that they were going to come and beat up my dad and beat up my brother unless I got involved in the prostitution. So at that point, Robert Linthicum realized like nothing in seminary had prepared him for this situation that he was in, because what he realized is that, I guess converting somebody and getting them into a Bible study is not going to change this type of issue. We have to do something about the system, because what was happening was white suburbanite men were providing bribes and money to the police force because these young African-American women were involved in prostitution, and they were not being taken advantage of by people in their own community. They were being taken advantage of by the powerful in the city, and the police were in on it. And there was major, major corruption. And if I'm a Christian, I can't look at that issue as a Christian if I'm truly being rooted in the Bible. Okay.
Come on.
If I go to Isaiah 5, I got plenty of resources to attack that system. Plenty of resources, because it says right there, you acquit the guilty for a bribe, but then you deny justice to the innocent.
Man.
The whole point of the prophets was to come and to bring correction to people who they feel were the people of God, were allowing people to be oppressed, whether it was the foreigner, the widow, those kinds of things. And the reality is that it's going to come with a cost. It's going to come at our expense to recognize, oh, we might be benefiting from things like that. We might be part of the problem. We might be complicit in this. We might actually be the ones perpetrating. And that takes a lot of humility.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I think we have plenty of biblical warrant to say, you know what, we're going to have to give unique attention to these things. And it's not bad that we're doing that. It's not bad that we're going after things like more systemic issues, like all kinds of things. And the church can't just say, I'm going to only try to bring change at the individual level, because yes, it might confront their souls, but it may not confront their idols. Jesus almost got executed before he ever went to the cross. And it was when in Luke 4, when he comes to the people, when he starts preaching, and he basically says he's God in human form. He opens up Isaiah and says, I'm here, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. I'm here to give sight to the blind, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, set the captives free. And what's funny is he says the prophecy is fulfilled in me today. And the people are like, is that Mary and Joseph's son? That's so fascinating. That's so interesting. He says he literally is God. It's like the most blasphemous thing you could do as a Jew, to like say that you are God in human form. And they merely find him interesting. But then he goes on to say that a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon ministered to Elisha at that time. And then Naaman the Syrian was cleansed of leprosy. Basically saying there are plenty of widows in the Jewish community, and there are also plenty of lepers. But we went and helped somebody in an area called Sidon, which was a pagan area. Right. And we helped, for goodness sakes, a Syrian gentleman, Naaman, who right after he's healed, asked Elijah for permission to go and worship in a false temple because he's like trying to do this. Wow. And Jesus says God told them to be involved in the foreigner's life.
Yeah.
Essentially saying the gospel is for people of all ethnicities.
Yep.
So he's made two claims. He says, I am God in human form, and the gospel is for people of all ethnicities. When he claims to be God, the people find him interesting. When he says that the gospel is for people of all ethnicities, they try to throw him off a cliff.
Wow.
One confronted their souls for salvation, that it's in me. But one confronted their idols, which is that, oh, at my expense, some other people might get help. Some Gentiles might get involved in this, this system here. And I don't know how I can look at that as a Christian and then think, oh, well, maybe there ought to be something to be done at a more institutional level.
That's good.
And bringing reform in those things. And it's not just personal conversion. So that was kind of a long-winded way to say, I think that we as believers and as a church, as the church, can certainly get involved in these issues and frankly, not get into the political extremism on either side.
Yeah.
And we don't have to bow down to the binaries. It's not like we have to choose between, because I actually reject both things. I want to say, you know what? Yeah, we need to help reform the family structure and provide healthier families and healthier communities. We need to stop the crime that happens, in our communities. But what ends up happening is anytime you push against, like, we need to change the police, we need to end systematic racism, people on the other side will go, no, the real problem is the black on black crime. It's like, why can't it just be both and? Like, I don't know a single black church pastor that is not concerned and is not actively working with trying to reduce crime in their neighborhood. The mere suggestion that they're not doing that is ignorant.
Yep.
and frankly reveals a lack of proximity in relationships.
Yes.
I don't know why I need to choose between one of those two things.
Yes.
Because the Bible's not, you know what the Bible would say? If you say, well, is it really power structures, or is it really just individual behavior? The Bible would go, yeah. Yeah, it's both and.
Yep.
And so I don't see why the church has to choose either.
Yeah.
We need to attack issues that really help with both things.
Absolutely. And I think before going to Jeff, as we wrap up, like, I think ultimately that's what that's something that I've been learning so much right now, that, you know, that I went back to school and studying theology, is I see, man, the church, God is involved in everything, right? In every area of our lives, in every area in the community, in every area in the world, he's involved. He's there. He's got something to say about everything. And it's the same for the church, man. Like, I feel like that's something that I've seen in the American church has been, we're going to wash our hands and not be involved in this. We're going to stay quiet in this matter, right? Or, you know, or what you said. And I think the individualistic side of things is almost a cop out to not address the collective issues, right? And I think you put it, I don't even got to go any further. The way you put it, it's clear. We're called for both. We're called to be involved in both. You know, and Christ was.
That's right. And sin is more interrelated than we think. I mean, even with the situation that I described with the Robert Linthicum, with the police force being involved in that corruption. You know, Amos, in Amos chapter 2, it talks about how a father and a son have sex with the same woman and they sell the poor for a pair of shoes. Like, the Bible says that sexual sin and economic injustice are part of the same cloth. You know, it goes, that doesn't make a huge distinction. It's a both. It's connected in some way.
Yeah.
They don't see a distinction. And so again, I just hope that we're formed, that we really truly become people of the book. And because if African Americans and other groups that find themselves under oppression, whether perceived or otherwise, if they're rooting that in the scripture, maybe they can teach us some things. Maybe they, because it was what I totally reject the conservative side that says this stuff is, you know, to say the systemic racism is a myth. I just reject that. Please go and talk with some African American and others, church leaders, that would be able to show you these kinds of things. And by the way, if you have a lot of data to support, well, you know, the statistics say this, and, you know, only this many unarmed people were actually shot, and then, you know, actually, you know, it's more about this statistic and not that statistic. We're Christians. We don't let science tell us what we ought to do. I thought that was frowned upon, actually, frankly, in the conservative Christian community. So why do we immediately want to use statistics as our barometer for like what we ought to do?
Only when it's convenient.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. But here's what I also reject on the other side, which is that the reason all of this exists is because Christianity has had such a stain on so many of these institutions being poor because of the sin of the church. Therefore, we need to reject the church wholesale. We need to reject the Bible. The Bible justified slavery. The Bible did this. The Bible did that. And no, because actually, even the slaves, African American slaves, found in the very Bible, used to kind of justify why they were being oppressed. They actually found out that God disagreed with the slave owner. So if you're a liberal and you're saying the reason that this all happened was because the Bible was the Bible is shady, it's like you're actually just removing the very source of hope that I use to hold people accountable. So you're actually saying the slave master was right, and I don't have time for that. So like both approaches are completely fallible and incorrect.
Yeah.
And are we forming the kind of people in our churches that can be able to critique both sides like that?
That's good.
And root it back in the Bible. But ultimately, if we're not engaging with scripture and we're not engaging with people that are different than us, that also affirm all of our same core theological convictions, then we have to come to the table and we have to have a dialogue about these things. But the problem is that I think we're just lumping people in. I mean, some of the things that you guys are saying, some people might say, oh, you're just like fill in the blank. You're just like them. You're just like those people over there. It's like, well, not really, because I kind of affirm Jesus as Savior and salvation is by grace and like all these like major things that like the other side clearly wouldn't do. But because we're not willing to have dialogue, it's disappointing. Right. It really, really is. And I look, the only way solutions are going to come is if we talk and we have dialogue like we're doing tonight. But ultimately, if it's not rooted in the Bible, then what are we doing? Yeah. Honestly, like if what obligation do I have to do any of this stuff? Do you guys have to do any of this stuff if the Bible doesn't talk about it?
It's good.
Seriously.
Yeah. Jeff.
Yeah, just to finish, it's interesting that you mentioned Isaiah, because when I read that text, I see it as like modern, I see it as ancient gentrification. You know, that's essentially what's going on. But there isn't just Isaiah. There's Luke 3:14 with John the Baptist telling the Roman soldiers to not extort, right? Telling tax collectors, do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages, right? And those soldiers were basically a form of policing, a form of policing the peace of the empire, right? And then the other thing, you know, in conversation with in how the church can engage in this conversation. A couple of points, but the first one is with Dr. King. Like I mentioned in this podcast before, when Dr. King gave his first speech, when he accepted the role of leader of one of the organizations that was in the forefront of the civil rights movement, one of the things he says is that the way he saw it was that God was going to move with or without him. That the civil rights movement was initiated by God, and that God was going to lead it to its completion with or without him. And I mean, we know how the story unfolds, but the fact that Dr. King took on that stance, essentially saying, either I'm with God or I'm against him. Either I'm with God or I'm without him. And then God is going to do it regardless. And so might as well join God in what God is doing, you know?
Yeah.
And then that requires a paradigm shift in terms of how God moves, right? And the things in which God is involved in. And the other thing is that not everyone will lead direct action. Not everyone is called to lead direct action. Not everyone is called to be involved in, let's say, to be at the table with the chief of police and the mayor and community leaders, and that's fine. Not all of us have to be there. It starts with us having conversations with our friends, our family members, our small groups, right? And then one of the things, and another thing is we need to begin to form people who see the protection of the least of these as essential, right? The police. The role of the police, the work of police has to be good news to the poor. It has to be good news to the poor. If it's not good news to the poor, then we're doing it wrong. And the poor, according to Luke, are not just the people begging for money in the corner, or people who are homeless. The poor are the meaning of poor is expanded, right? The meaning of poor is expanded to people who are being marginalized, right? People who are experiencing loneliness, people who are experiencing injustice. It's expanded, right? And in that context, the least of these, it was used to describe children, and children were at the bottom of the social totem pole. They were seen as useless and incapable of contributing anything. So the question we got to ask ourselves is, who are the least of these today? And is the role and job of the police good news to those people? Right. And then what you brought up, Zach, can church leaders disciple officers? And can officers who are attending our churches allow themselves to be discipled? And that's going to require uh, a deeper dive into these kind of discussions by leaders. They have to be able to disciple, right? It can't just be anybody. And so I think those are some of the things that were just kind of going through my mind.
No, that's good. And right now you brought that up, that last point. I'm thinking maybe it's time for the church to evaluate what it's teaching on a Sunday, what it's teaching during the small groups, and really think about, because it's not like, it's not only the police officer, it's the person that you know is not empathizing with with people that don't live the same life as they do, right? Live completely a different life, but being able to say, hey, like, you know let me sit down with you and understand, and try, or at least try to understand, what you're dealing with, what you're going through. Let me be able to pray for you. Let me be able to walk with you, but but to the extent of, like, if I'm gonna walk with you, I'm not talking about metaphorically, I'm talking about literally, like, you're coming alongside that person and you're walking with them, and I think that I think I'm realizing this episode made me realize that this whole conversation of the theology of policing, it's bigger than just the policing. There's got to be something that we have to address within the Christian heart, right? Within the heart of specifically the American Christian, right? I can't speak for anybody else outside of this country. There's been a lot that we've come to realize in our country right now, that we have to address in the American church. And I think it's a hard issue that we have to talk about. And I think, Zach, you did a great job in just I think bringing up to light what the problem is. It's that individualism, individualism, and the lack of seeing it as a collective. Like, this is a collective thing. And it makes me think back to the church, to the early church, right? It was all about community, man. Like, even you know, to the level of, like, the finances and the money and everything else. Like, there was nobody that was like, nobody within the church was struggling. If you were struggling, the church would make sure you weren't, you were taken care of. And that, we don't like to talk about that as much, but it's very contradicting to the American way of viewing, our money and our wealth and our what we own, right? Like, and
Well, yeah, just that phrase, the phrase that the money we own, it's not our money.
Yeah.
I mean, if that idea got through, how much that would be a game changer. That's not actually our wealth. It's God's money, and we're just stewarding it for a bit,
Right. And so I'd love to continue this conversation, but we we went in. So we're gonna continue and kind of dive deeper into this conversation. Just so you guys know, we're gonna be diving into an amazing book. It's called Reading While Black by Esau McCaulley. We're gonna be diving into specifically chapter 2 in the upcoming week or two, maybe even longer. We might even go into the whole book, because it's pretty much the book is about the African American interpretation, right, of the Bible, like their biblical interpretation. And this is the last thing I'm gonna say. You brought this up, Zach, and just that the biblical interpretation of the African American community, and you involved all minorities, but I would even say, like, I feel like even the Hispanic community lacks a level of it too. We do understand it as minorities. We do kind of share with it, but not I feel like not as deep as the African American community, to be honest, man. You know, and Jeff could correct me if I'm wrong, but just growing up in a Hispanic church, I feel like many times we took on that same stance. Our churches took on the same stance of like, we're not going to talk about these issues. We're not going to talk about these things.
Yeah, and I would say it's not because they didn't want to. I think they weren't. They didn't know how.
Yeah.
And not only that, but most of our family, like they don't come with papers. They don't. It's just the truth. They don't come with citizenship. And I believe there's this deep, like, you're already living an underground life. Why would you expose yourself by speaking into these kind of issues?
Yeah,
and I do think though that we might not share the same interest in issue or deep concern in the same issues in terms of the Black community and the Latina community. But the Latina community does have its tradition, its rich tradition in theology and church and social movements, but not really related to the police, but definitely related to the state, and to government and to economic exploitation, which, like you said, Zach, they're connected.
And I think there's a level of it. I feel like the Latino community is a bit more complex because you have the groups that are like almost elite even within the Latino community, you know, and so there's a lot of complexity there. So we're gonna dive deep into this. So I urge you to continue check out the upcoming episodes as well. Please share this with somebody. Let's have these conversations. Reach out to us. We want to have these conversations with you guys. And so that's it for today. Thank you guys for checking us out. Thank you guys for tuning in. This was the Barrio Podcast.